Welcome to Screaming Reverberations, a podcast traversing the histories and contexts of the work of Thomas Pynchon. I'm Geena.
And I'm Frank. And in this episode, we're going to be continuing our exploration of former LADA and California Attorney General Evelle Younger. This is going to be part 2 of that series.
Right, part 2.
Part 2, thank you. And during the course of this, we're going to see him interacting with a lot of events, just loaded with Pynchonian significance. Among them, we're going to see the early years of Black nationalism and Black Islam in LA. We're going to see some of the moves towards the MKUltra programs that would come to dominate California towards the end of the 60s and into the early 70s. And we're going to see connections to any number of sinister figures, from fascists to mobsters to rapists. We've been researching these episodes primarily by using newspapers, newspapers.com, with their expensive-ass subscription fee. And that's a tedious method, evidenced by how long it takes to make some of these Evelle Younger episodes. It can take a while. But it is a gold mine. I will say that, I think I know more about Evelle Younger than probably he ever fucking knew at this point. You know, if you're willing to sort through the horse shit, there is a lot of stuff on newspapers.com. This is not an advertisement. This is just, if you've got the money to chuck at that yearly subscription fee, it's not a bad way to spend it. You know, for a lot of Evelle Younger's life, even into the 40 years after his death, there's not really a lot that you can look at in, published books. There's a few stray references here and there. They're literally just references for the most part. There's not a substantive biography. There's not anything of any real weight. So what you have to do is you just have to go on to the newspapers and go day by day and collate all of the shit that you find. Everything, which a lot of it's fucking useless, but there's plenty of shit to find in there. A lot of the things we're going to be discussing, they've been found and collated from a lot of LA area newspapers. And in the sake of not only time, but also, my own personal laziness, we have not taken the time to cite a lot of the newspaper sources. A lot of this stuff is findable with a newspaper's subscription, and we collated it from, not to keep using that fucking word. We put it together. Typically, there'll be, 2 or 3, 4 or 5 newspaper reports on a specific thing. All of them in different papers from the LA County area. To cite them, it would just be a fucking chore on everybody's part, I think.
Right, and since we're not doing a written format, we're not required to cite every fucking source. But we have cited,
right.
But we are going to cite some major sources that you can look up for yourself.
I will always cite a book. Some of these have been cited when they're very good articles, and it's just the one article. A lot of it's not, and I don't really worry about that. If you want to, we can just roll right back into it and pick right back up in 1958 with our biography of Evelle.
In 1958, Evelle runs for the position of Superior Court Judge against an 86-year-old incumbent and wins, moving up from his position as a municipal court judge. The same year, his sister-in-law, Elizabeth Eberhard Ziegler, is appointed as a Los Angeles County municipal judge herself, further cementing the younger Eberhard's family's presence in the world of the California court system.
And then later on, in mid-1958, Evelle Younger is assigned as chairman of the American Bar Association's Committee on Narcotics and Alcohol. This puts him in close collaboration with the American Medical Association's own drug studies in the late 1950s, many of which were used as cover for early MKUltra experiments. Younger cites an inspiration from the quote-unquote British method, which was developed at least partially at the infamous Tavistock Institute, which he explains as the treatment of addiction as a medical and a social problem rather than a legal one. But this can also be read very darkly given the coming flood of heroin into California's black and countercultural communities, specifically delivered by the U.S. government as a means of pacifying a liberation struggle. Younger will come to play a pivotal role in the Watts insurrection, so central to the text of Inherent Vice, a topic we discussed in our last episode, a reading of Pynchon's A Journey into the Mind of Watts, and which we will explore further later in this episode.
In 1958, Mildred is appointed to serve as an advisor to the Federal Reformatory for Women, which places her directly under President Eisenhower and the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, an institution to remember for later. One of her fellow advisors was Clover Dulles, wife of CIA czar and parapolitical legend Allen Dulles. The Younger family had numerous ties to the Dulles family and those who'd worked closely with them.
So, New Year's Eve 1958, the Youngers are among those who attend a farewell party for Robert Finch, who is leaving Palos Verdes to become Vice President Nixon's administrative assistant. Finch will later serve as Ronald Reagan's lieutenant governor, and will become a member of Nixon's presidential cabinet, serving as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare before becoming counselor to the president. This is yet another case of Younger being contradicted regarding his claims of not being too close to Nixon. Younger and Finch would remain closely associated both personally and politically.
In 1959, Evelle Younger was elected yearly president of the Los Angeles Peace Officers Shrine Club, a subset of the Shriners devoted specifically to law enforcement charity. Some of the Shriner events held by the LAPOSC, LA Piece of Shit Club, during this time would attract up to 1,000 Shriners and other affiliated law enforcement personnel. Some of these events were emceed by comedian Danny Thomas, a co-founder of St. Jude's Children's Cancer Fund, a fact made all the more ominous by Jimmy Fallon Gong's work on Program to Chill regarding the Shriners, their connections to sex trafficking, and their possible involvement in the Johnny Gosch disappearance murder. This also contradicts our statement in the last episode that Younger was not a Mason. He seems to have been both a Mason and a Shriner.
You have to be a Mason to be a Shriner.
Right. Younger was also a passionate member of the American Legion, whose fascist connections were discussed at length in our episode about the American Security Council.
This time, Evelle is serving as a Superior Court judge here in LA, and a lot of his time on the Superior Court is very uneventful, and this seems to have at least partially contributed to the short amount of time that he spent at that post. Much of Evelle's time as a Superior Court judge is uneventful, and this seems to have at least partially contributed to the short amount of time he spent at that post. However, during his time as a Superior Court judge, he presided over a particularly salient case, a pre-Watts eruption of racial tension in Los Angeles regarding the murder of the Nation of Islam's LA branch secretary, Ronald X. Stokes, during an assault by the police, described in the media as a riot, outside the Muhammad Mosque No. 27 on the northern fringe of south central Los Angeles. Stokes, originally from Boston, was claimed to have been one of the first college-educated men in the NOI. His wife, Dolores, came from a family of long-time NOI members, her father having worked with Elijah Muhammad, the nation's second president. All of this information comes from a book called Pillars of Fire, The King Years, 1963 to 1965 by Taylor Branch, by the way.
Around midnight on April 27, 1962, LAPD officers shot 7 unarmed African Americans in an assault lasting over half an hour and involving at least 2 distinct outbreaks of gunfire. This erupted outside a mosque in South LA after LAPD officers accosted an employee of a dry cleaning company attempting to make a sale of discarded dress clothes to an NOI member. The officers proceeded to get into a fist fight with the men, and after 2 few, quote-unquote, concerned passers-by, both actually black off-duty LAPD officers, stopped, the scene degenerated into melee and gunfire both inside and outside of the mosque, ultimately culminating in the murder of Ronald Stokes outside Mosque Number 27, shot by one officer after apparently putting another of the officers in a headlock.
So Branch's book contains a highly detailed, if slightly fatuous, account of the shooting for those interested in more. Let it suffice to say for now that these events seem to me, and Geena both, highly suspicious. They reek of framing and cover-up, and they took place within the context of a deep animosity and conspiracy against the Nation of Islam from not only the entirety of white Los Angeles society, but also from a lot of middle-class Christian blacks in LA, too. A fact worth noting is that LA's black community has historically been strongly Christian. A lot of the first developments of modern American Pentecostalism began here in LA in the black churches of Azusa Street, and this was in the early 1900s. I think that started in like 1912, the early 1900s.
LA County newspapers had condemned the NOI since their first mention of the group's presence in the area in 1962, despite the fact that the NOI was a well-established group with a history already dating back 30-plus years. Many of these newspaper reports refer to the group as a quote-unquote secret society and talk about them as though they were a voodoo cult from a pulp magazine. Almost all contemporary news reports refer to all black Muslims as members of a cult. In the aftermath of Stokes' murder, LAPD Chief Whiskey Bill Parker specifically framed the events in the language of Aryan race defense, describing the NOI as, quote, intent on the very destruction of the Caucasian race itself, end quote.
None other than Evelle Younger was on hand to indict 9 of the Muslim victims, several of whom had been left in critical condition after their assault by police. One had been shot 5 times, and another spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. These decisions were made in what the fascist LA Times called unprecedented night sessions of the court. Despite being mostly forgotten today, the murder, assaults, and subsequent trial created a huge uproar in the civil rights movement of the era, and Malcolm X personally flew into Los Angeles to be present with the city's Muslim community. And Elijah Muhammad's lack of action in terms of moving the NOI in a more civil rights-oriented direction following these events would be a key moment in Malcolm's decision to split from the NOI.
Aside from Evelle Younger's presence during these events, this also speaks deeply to Inherent Vice's character, Tariq Khalil. We never learn if this is Tariq's birth name or a name he took upon a possible conversion to Islam, but regardless, he is obviously a black Muslim revolutionary and a member of George Jackson's Black Guerrilla family, who will have their own intersection with Evelle Younger in the opening years of the 1970s. Tariq's name actually intersects in a fascinating way with Doc's. Where sportello means little door or small opening in Italian, Tariq in Arabic means to strike, and Khalil means friend. Although this fits perfectly with Tariq's status as a black revolutionary, to make things more complex and to reach our connection with the name sportello, Tariq specifically is used to refer to the act of knocking on a door or visiting in general, and even more specifically, the act of visiting quietly in the dead of night. In the Quran, Tariq is used many times to refer to bright stars in the night sky, in a metaphor for the manner in which their light strikes the eye. This could be placed in line with the fact that Tariq's leads are the first real thing for Doc to follow. For much of the plot, Tariq's leads serve as a kind of north star for Doc to follow.
So Tariq's history of being uprooted from his childhood home in Gardena makes him a member of the social class that primarily composed the NOI, not just in LA, but nationwide. These were deeply oppressed inner-city African Americans with no hope of ever reaching even the assimilated middle class that is still more or less presented as the apex of black American respectability. This is also the exact class of people that the American narco state is going to target, originally with heroin, later with crack cocaine, leading to the present expression of the same problem in a return to opioids. Tariq has other aspects that tie him to the topic of this episode, chiefly his membership in George Jackson's Black Guerrilla family, whose history with Evelle Younger we're going to explore further in our next episode.
That's right, we have more Evelle.
It's gotta have.
Yeah.
There's so much. There's too much.
Right, and not to toot our own horn, but our series of episodes is the definitive treatment of Evelle Younger so far. I mean, other than Mae Brussel.
Right, I would highly recommend, if you search Evelle Younger on the Internet Archive, you're gonna pull up a bunch of Mae Brussel episodes, at least if you search, like, the metadata stuff, and all of those are fantastic. I highly recommend those. Those are also gonna point you towards a book by a man named Louis Tackwood. I highly recommend that book. That book is mostly gonna be the meat of our next episode. There is so much that gets turned up by going through this man's life day by day, and I feel like we would not be doing our job, which is to tell you interesting things, if we didn't tell you the things that we found. And in my opinion, like, I've cut a bunch of stuff. There's a bunch of stuff where it's like, okay, that's interesting, but it don't really tie. All of these things kind of tie into an arc. So, if you can bear with us, you will see that all of this is fruitful. And I think we are unearthing why Pynchon chose to drop that name in Inherent Vice.
Yeah, especially so early on. That's like setting the stage for the events of Inherent Vice.
Right, in the opening pages of the book, and using that name just the one time. But, like, the specter of the LA legal system is, like, hanging over all of Inherent Vice. It's important enough, I think.
Towards the end of 1962, Younger's anti-narcotic zeal surfaced again when, along with Los Angeles City Foreman Vern Orr, that's ORR, he attempted to...
It's a goofy-ass name.
Right. He attempted to introduce legislation mandating the, quote, compulsory treatment of drug addicts through a civil commitment similar to procedures used in confining mental cases to institutions, unquote, and which would also enact stricter sentences on narcotics offenses, increase the number of police assigned to fight the burgeoning war on drugs, and perhaps most menacingly, quote, it would allow anyone to go to the district attorney and report that they know an addict or someone in danger of becoming one. The addict or potential addict would then be picked up and examined by 2 doctors, and upon their diagnosis, a court hearing would be arranged, end quote. He also called for, quote, funding of treatment for teenage addicts, end quote, which could be seen as eerily in line with characters like Japonica Fenway. Many of these proposals found their way into law in the aftermath of the Watts Riots of 1965.
In July 1963, then LA DA Bill McKesson announced that he would not be seeking re-election in 1964. For several months before McKesson's announcement, rumors had been flying in the LA press about Evelle Younger's possible candidacy for DA. On a very Pynchonian note, an LA Times article from April of 1963 mentions Younger discussing his candidacy for DA at, quote, a private party for a small group of DJs and sports writers, a sentence which reeks of the crying of Lot 49's Mucho Mas. However, almost concurrent with McKesson's announcement of retirement was his announcement in front of the press and assembled legal community of LA that he would be filing an affidavit of prejudice against Evelle Younger and another DA hopeful, seeking to disqualify them as trial judges.
McKesson charged that Younger had committed several breaches of ethics regarding campaign funding, primarily that he was serving as a judge while collecting funds for a campaign that had not yet publicly been announced yet. Younger, who was in Washington, D.C., serving his yearly 2 weeks of detached Air Force Reserve service, where he rose to the rank of Brigadier General, immediately denied not only the charges, but also denied that he was contemplating running for DA at all. McKesson's charges would not be upheld by the court, and McKesson's main goal seems to have been advancing his own chief deputy as his chosen successor. But this would not be the last time Evelle Younger would be accused of mismanagement of campaign funds. Not long afterwards, in early 1964, Younger's campaign would run into a similar set of controversies when it was revealed that many of the names circulating on a list of Los Angeles attorneys supporting him had not been consulted about the use of their names, with nearly all of them voicing mobilizing support for Younger's Democratic opposition. Not long after that, Younger's Democratic opponent, Vincent Dalsmer, accused him of attempting to buy the support of the Mexican American Political Association in exchange for $3,000 worth of campaign advertising for a high-ranking MAPA member running for a California assembly seat.
In August 1963, upon returning home from his yearly Air Force service in D.C., and following his swift and strong defense by the press in the face of McKesson's charges, Evelle Younger was honored by California Democrats at a reception at the home of a prominent family called the Mahonies. In attendance was Beverly Hills tax wizard Paul Zifrin, who would later organize many fundraising dinners for Younger, and a longtime associate and friend of Southern California crime czar Sidney Korshak. This is far from the last time Korshak's name will appear on this show. Zifrin had begun his career as an IRS tax lawyer in our favorite city of Chicago, before moving west during World War II. He would later work in close collaboration with President Reagan as a member of the board planning the 1984 Olympics held here in LA. Paul's son Ken probably came into contact with Mildred Younger while both were working for Earl Warren in the early 60s. As recently as 2021, an octogenarian Ken Zifrin was still a major figure, serving as LA's quote-unquote film czar. That is not my term, that is literally what they call it, and what that means is that Ken Zifrin represents the entirety of Los Angeles County within the California film industry tax credit scheme, which I would have to imagine means he basically represents the entire fucking industry. How many movies get made here in California that aren't made here, you know what I mean?
Right, that's a really powerful position.
Yeah, right, it's not like there's some bustling film industry up in fucking San Francisco other than like Skywalker Ranch and Marin County, you know what I mean? Like, It's like if you represent all of LA County within the fucking tax credit scheme, you represent the whole fucking film industry. Later Society page reports from 1963 feature the Younger schmoozing at parties hosted by the fascist LA Times czar Otis Chandler, whose paper maintained a steadfast defense of Younger and his ideals. Virtually any time Younger spoke out on an issue, within several days there would appear a typically sensational article in the LA Times regarding the same substance.
You left out the fascist LA Times.
But you can, this is a very regular pattern that I noticed reading these newspapers.
Those fascist newspapers?
Well, and if
the LA Times,
Times case, yeah.
We need to have, like, how Trump does, like, his things with the hands going. The fascist LA Times.
I wish I could do his
Right,
thing.
I can't do a Trump.
I can't.
That's too bad.
Can match, even if you can do the voice.
You need the extra stuff.
Doing the voice is only a third of the way there.
Right.
Because you have to be able to stutter like him. You have to be able to repeat the way he. That's my favorite thing about the way he talks is the way he'll repeat. He'll say a thing and then he'll say it again because he liked what he said so much. They call him Sleepy Joe. Sleepy Joe. They call him.
Right. Yeah.
He's
very discursive.
His rhythms are insane. Not to give him credit, but
anyway, let's go on. In October of 1963, Younger suggested passing into law an early form of what would eventually evolve into reasonable suspicion, the right that allows police to stop anyone, demand information, and then arrest them if dissatisfied with said information. This is one of the earliest manifestations of Younger's drive towards modernizing the police system of California as a whole from its earlier Freikorps-esque formation and into its modern status as full-blown technocratic Gestapo. It's worth noting that one of Younger's continual points in his regular public lectures into his days as DA was his frustration with the difficulty of convincing people, repeatedly telling assembled crowds of Southland Masons, geriatrics, and police dinner clubs that American civilians now had, quote-unquote, too many individual rights. His proposals drew vociferous opposition from many, mostly in Black and Latino communities, all of whom called it a fascistic policy in the mold of Nazi Germany. Younger also made many statements of a moderate slant, such as a desire to update arrest records so that those arrested and not charged would not have permanent records. What this amounted to in practice, though, was making legal the ability for police to arrest a person for any suspicion, hold them for any length of time, and never make a record of their arrest.
Right, like a bunch of he was calling for all this, like, really freaky shit when you, like, break it all down.
Like in a modernizing.
You know, like, he was calling for all this stuff where it's like, we arrest all these people and then we let them go. And then, we arrest all these people in the case of a routine investigation, and it's what you have to do. But, this guy that we arrest, he has this permanent record against him. And I don't think that man should have a permanent record against him if he's proven not guilty, if he's not proven of anything.
Right, it's very, like, blue sky liberal.
Right, he was very good at that shit. And then you break it down and it's literally like they wanted to do, it's like ICE shit. They wanted to, like, fucking just snatch you off the street and there's no record that they ever took you. You've basically been kidnapped by the federal government. You've been fucking black hole. Really freaky shit. Combine this shit with, like, they're gonna send people to mental hospitals, like, if you go to the DA and say that they could become a drug addict, not even that they are, but they could become one.
It's so scary.
It's fucking crazy shit.
Nightmare fuel.
In early January of 1964, Evelle Younger began his campaign for DA of LA County. One of the central tenets of his platform was a declaration of total war on crime in all forms. Younger accompanied this with an onslaught of public speaking events, which, although nothing new for either one of the Youngers, began to take on an increasingly fear-mongering tone. Titles became things like "The Fight Against Crime, We Are Losing It," and "Crime in the Space Age," and topics included the immensity of the crime rate in proportion to the population, and his concern that criminals are getting younger, and that the courts were mollycoddling juvenile offenders and second-guessing our police officers. Younger's consistent theme of turning teenagers into a class of hypothetical criminals ran strong. In 1966, he'd go on to give his Crime in the Space Age presentation at the central facility of Rocket 9 in Canoga Park, the primary inspiration for V and the Crying of Lot 49's Yo-Yo Dine, with Canoga Park being the inspiration for San Narciso. Rocket Dine's history as a company ultimately originates from the American studies on recovered German V-2 rockets, and Canoga Park is mentioned exactly twice in Inherent Vice, with both mentions being very ominous. The first is Canoga Park being the setting when Bigfoot offers Doc COINTELPRO work, offering to pay him with evidence locker weed. Bigfoot later takes Doc back to Canoga Park after he's killed Adrian Prussia, with Doc's car being impounded and loaded with heroin there. Younger also spent his campaign calling for extensive, quote, social studies on crime, unquote, a theme to tuck in your pocket for later, and he spoke extensively about increasing the severity of the state homosexuality laws, saying that they provided inadequate protection. It's worth noting that at the time, the penalties of this would not have been time in prison, but time in a Atascadero state hospital or another similar facility. Atascadero, which aside from being a notorious MK Ultra facility, was also being commonly referred to at the time as quote-unquote Dachau for queers. Fucking Atascadero. I highly recommend, we always recommend our guiding light, a guiding light. One of them, Jimmy Fallon Gong's work. Jimmy's done some great work on Atascadero in his FBI versus PTK series. And just a notorious fucking hellhole of a place. Absolutely barbaric. Some of the worst shit you could ever choose to read.
Younger also began holding constant fundraising dinners at the price of $100 a plate, roughly $1K in 2026. A number of these dinners had over 1,000 attendees, netting 2026 profits of over $1 million for these fucking large dinners. They're also accompanied by glowing talk in the press regarding his credentials. Although McKesson's charges against him had been officially dismissed, the local branch of the Bar Association lodged continual complaints against Younger through early 1964 for campaigning for DA while still sitting on the bench as a Superior Court judge. Younger accused the LA County Bar Association with attempting to act as quote-unquote kingmakers and refused to step down from the bench. Despite these speed bumps, Younger ran a very successful campaign with many LA area unions, most of which we should know were controlled by organized crime, with the aforementioned Cindy Korshak playing a large role in a number of these, supporting him, and some LA papers calling it one of the most successful quote-unquote nonpartisan campaigns in the county's history.
So Younger chose a former sheriff of LA County for 26 years. How did we say this was pronounced? Eugene Biscaylos? Biscaylos. Mm-hmm. He headed the nonpartisan Citizens Committee to elect Judge Evelle Younger. Biscaylos' father had been a highly influential and wealthy lawyer in turn-of-the-century Los Angeles who had drunk himself apparently to insanity. This is from LA newspapers, of course. I didn't read any case of him doing something nutty. That's just what the papers said. Prior to his tenure as sheriff, though, Eugene Biscaylos had organized the original incarnation of the California Highway Patrol way back in 1929. During his time leading the LA Sheriff Department, Biscaylos pioneered the practice of sending LA County prisoners to labor camps, and he would later pioneer the first use of airplanes and helicopters by the LA Sheriff's Office, serving as a test bed for the entire state's adoption of aerial policing, and we really get to see that drawn out really well in Vineland. There's so much centrality to the police helicopter and police airplanes in that novel.
And just as a side, if you want to look up this guy, his name is spelled Biscailuz. In November of 64, Younger is finally elected DA after the relatively bitter and intensive campaign that seems to have nearly completely eclipsed his work as a Superior Court judge, where nearly all of his newspaper mentions in 1963 are related to active cases he was adjudicating. Nearly every one of the over 1,100 mentions of Younger in 1964 are campaign advertising of one type or another. In December, when Younger was sworn in, his predecessor McKesson, who had so vehemently made breach of the ethics charges against Younger during the campaign, actually had a heart attack while watching Younger take his oath.
That's fucking crazy.
That is so committed to hatred,
That is,
oh my god.
That is some true blue hater shit.
Yeah.
But in an interesting turn of events, related to the assault on the Nation of Islam members by the LAPD that we mentioned, the death of Ronald Stokes. The attorney who had represented the NOI members, who had actually been an early black LAPD officer turned lawyer named Earl Brody. He had been one of the LAPD's rare black officers during the period of Bill Parker's leadership. He wound up named as Evelle Younger's chief deputy DA, and he would swiftly rise from that position to Younger's former position as a Superior Court judge here in LA. And he would do that in a matter of, if I remember correctly, it was less than a year.
Mm-hmm.
It was very fast. Younger made the contradictory statement that although he didn't hire Brody on account of his race, he also said, "I think his presence will improve communications between this office and parts of the community that don't have much faith in the district attorney's office," which is a very fucking classically Evelle Younger statement if there's ever going to be one. And by the the end of December, he's also going to have appointed Lynn Buck Compton, who is discussed at length in Tom O'Neill's Chaos, and a number of other people. He's bolstering the DA's office with a lot of new blood in preparation for an assault on the pornography industry here in LA. Although it's not the most earth-shaking changes in the world, he changed a lot of stuff immediately in the DA's office. He totally overhauled the staff practices within a month or two. The pay of a number of the positions at the DA's office went up immediately and quite substantially. And he also began headhunting for employees for the DA's department at colleges nationwide. I think that makes it pretty explanatory why, like, there's this, like, sexy young woman like Penny Kimball, and she, like, winds up, I don't know, like, yeah, like, Penny's probably going to law school or something, but it's like, she winds up at a DA's office, what seems like fairly young. You know what I mean?
Right, it seems like there's a drive to recruit fresh.
Right. Like a recruitment drive like that. It seems like there were a lot of, like, fairly young people at the DA's office in some way or another.
On February 16, 1965, Younger spoke before the assembled Industrial Security Community of America at the 1965 Industrial Security Conference. We find this notable given what we discussed in our episode regarding the American Security Council. The ASC was not only composed primarily of ex-FBI agents like Younger, but many of them also worked part to full-time as heads of industrial security at various large companies and multinational corporations. One of the major displays advertised for the 1965 Industrial Security Conference was an electronic night watchman, an early form of electronic burglar alarm and security system. These are actually descended from technology originally developed by Leon Theremin, whose instrument features so heavily in Pynchon's Shadow Ticket, probably in relation to Theremin's many government contracted and espionage-related dealings. January 25, 1965, the LA Times reports a party held for Evelle Younger by LA attorney Paul Caruso. In a little over 4 years, Caruso would serve as Susan Atkins' defense attorney during the Manson trials. Also in attendance was comedian Don Rickles, a longtime friend of Frank Sinatra's, with many Hollywood crime connections of his own.
Right, we've again got our little thread of Frank Sinatra surfacing again. We are going to get to Frankie at length.
Right.
We're going to do that, don't worry.
It's gonna be brisk, baby.
At length, but also
Right.
brisk. We'll move it along.
Yeah, be breast. You know those commercials for, what was it, like
Remind
iced tea?
me.
There's these like commercials with like, I think like a claymation or an animated Frank Sinatra going, "It's brisk, baby," with like Lipton iced tea in a can.
I do. I kind of... Later in February of 1965, Evelle Younger would place Lynn Buck Compton in charge of a newly created section of the DA's office, whose purpose was to, quote, give legal advice to law enforcement officers on an around-the-clock basis. This service will include assistance in obtaining search warrants anywhere in the county at any hour, 7 days a week. Then, once again, we have Younger yet again involved in another brutal case of LAPD murder against the city's black population on April 10th of 1965, which was the murder of, he was either 18 or 19 years old, it's kind of hard to tell, John W. Grissom in his yard while he held his infant son, Andre. Fucking crazy, brutal case. Details on Grissom's murder are a little scanty, but the best information available is actually from his surviving family's lawsuit against the officers involved. The name of that case is Adeline Grissom et al. Versus Lee F. Logan et al. 1971. You can look that up and find the PDF of the trial documents.
Grissom is spelled Grisom.
Grissom's murder, though, it seems to have been, another one in an extremely long line of a tragically common case, which is the police murder of a black man in the midst of a mental health episode.
Grissom's mother, Adeline, called called the police because her son was, quote-unquote, acting strangely, and at that point her story and the police's diverged greatly. The police claimed repeatedly that Grisham's mother had claimed he had a gun, and when the police arrived, they testified to encountering Grisham in his living room with his 4-month-old son wrapped in a blanket in his arms. Police then testified that they glimpsed a revolver among the blankets, and Grisham began making statements that could be perceived as threats. They cautiously led him into the yard and placed a call for backup, which is when Grisham lunged for one of the officers and they shot him. Police testified Grisham tried to raise himself up to shoot them after being shot, whereupon they fired again. 8 shots had been fired and Grisham had been shot a total of 4 times.
Adeline Grisham and others present disputed telling the police that John was armed. She insisted she'd merely told them he'd recently bought a gun. They also stated that there had been no blanket to hide a gun in, that John was completely unarmed, and that aside from altering the position of his body before photographing it, the revolver he'd been found with had been planted on his body by a plainclothes police officer. Evelle Younger's office intersected with the case by way of responding to these eyewitness disputes with 12 separate accounts of perjury for Adeline Grisham. They also submitted to the courts a tape recording of Adeline's 911 call, which somehow had been, quote-unquote, accidentally recorded during a test of police department audio equipment. Adeline was heard saying on the tape when asked why she needed the police, quote, because he is so bad, and he has a gun on him, and I am not going back in there. Adeline and John's family would fight against the LAPD in California court in various forms until at least 1971. The results of their case are unknown to us. Former LAPD officer and future mayor and repeated gang-stalking target Tom Bradley would speak out vociferously against this and a rash of other police murders from the mid-1960s. We discussed Bradley's connections with the LAPD's P. Did and the Manson murders in some of our earlier episodes, and we'll be discussing all of that again soon in the future.
It's worth noting here that these were still relatively early days for the use of tape recordings as evidence, possibly the first in California legal history, plainly shown by the fact that 911 calls were not regularly recorded in 1965. And we have to ask ourselves if this is not another case of false evidence drummed up in support of police departments, a longtime skill of California PDs in particular, as so well shown in Dave McGowan's Program to Kill and its descendants. Which, it's also worth noting here that the LAPD's propensity for fortuitous accidents and coincidences, given this is our second one in less than a year.
You know, don't forget about, this quote-unquote riot at the Muhammad Mosque, and, as soon as all this breaks out, 2 fucking off-duty LAPD officers roll by, and they're like, what's happening here? Let me lend a helping hand, and it happens to be 2 LAPD officers. It's all of these things are just super fucking weird. I don't mean to say that any of this is particular to Evelle Younger's time as DA or anything. These are just LAPD tactics in general. I should read James Ellroy's novels set in the Evelle Younger day. His more recent ones extend into LA in the mid-60s and the 70s. And I wonder if Evelle Younger works into any of that shit, because James Ellroy would write the hell out of some of this.
Right. The beginning of Evelle's serious career could be said in many ways to be another in that line of acts of LAPD police violence, and in this case, one of the most historic acts of Black rebellion in the country's history, the Watts Uprising, which took place over 5 days in mid-August of 1965.
And, we went over the Watts Uprising and Pynchon's connections to it a little bit in our reading of his article, A Journey into the Mind of Watts. That was our last episode. So we will suffice to say here that the Watts Uprising erupted in the aftermath of the abusive arrest by the California Highway Patrol of Marquette Fry, his mother, and his brother Ronald. What ensued was was 5 days of fighting between the LAPD, the CHP, and eventually the National Guard against the civilian population of Watts and Greater LA in general. Watts was left even more crippled than it had already been. What had been a slum was left composed mostly of smoke and rubble. Mayor Ed Yorty, LAPD Chief Whiskey Bill Parker, and Evelle Younger himself were very quick to shift any of the blame for the insurrection away from the racist administration of LA, who had been forcing a black population that had been surging in numbers since the Depression into what were regularly described as some of the most brutal slums in the United States. LA County officials repeatedly placed the primary blame of Watts on the California Highway Patrol, despite the fact that most of these events erupted directly from the societal deprivation of Watts itself. The violence that the CHP committed against Marquette Fry and his family was basically a very short fuse on a bomb that had been laying wait in LA since the 20s, if you want to, longer. LA has a very long, fucked up racial history. And it's worth noting here, they want to lay all of this blame on the California Highway Patrol. The California Highway Patrol, as indicated by their name, they are a state agency based out of Sacramento, which at the time was under the Democratic governorship of Edmund Brown. And that's opposed to the rigidly Republican leadership here in LA County. And Pynchon notes this deeply racist character of Southern California multiple times. Inherent Vice and Vineland both depict Californians of this period, meeting a black person for the first time in their lives and they're acting like they're meeting somebody from fucking Mars. In spite of the city's attempts to shift all this blame onto the CHP, Younger later clears all of these CHP officers involved in this of any wrongdoing, because that's just, he fucking loves doing that. I don't think there's not a single case I've read about where Evelle Younger goes against a police officer.
Under Younger's supervision, the county set up unprecedented measures to handle the caseload of the nearly 3,500 people arrested in the aftermath of Watts. The majority of those arrested were not arrested for any violent behavior, but simply for curfew violations while the fighting was ongoing. Jails slated for demolition were hastily reopened and filled with people arrested during the 5 days of unrest. LA courts ran nearly 24 hours a day for almost 2 months, with some judges expected to pull triple shifts in the courtroom, processing those arrested in an industrial fashion. While Evelle Younger and other friends in the city hierarchy attempted to shift the blame to a source somewhere outside the city, preferably a source that had nothing to do with LA's racial strife or its land management, Younger's old friend from the Nation of Islam case, Earl Brody, was appointed as one of only 2 African Americans to Mayor Yorty's commission to investigate the causes of Watts and offer solutions. This commission, the McCone Commission, was headed by former CIA Director John A. McCone. McCone had previously served as JFK's replacement for Allen Dulles following the Bay of Pigs. Per Seymour Hersh, McCone was the source responsible for blowing the whistle regarding Israel's earliest attempts at the development of nuclear weapons. Also serving on the McCone Commission was Warren Christopher, who would later serve as Secretary of State under Bill Clinton. In a darkly ironic and probably uncoincidental turn, nearly 30 years later, Christopher would lead the Christopher Commission, which investigated the causes and the aftermath of the unrest following the beating of Rodney King. This commission also amounted to what Kurt Vonnegut would call, quote-unquote, diddly squat in terms of solving any of LA's racial issues.
Even though the McCone Commission is loaded with intelligence agents, police officers, DA employees, other people of this same ilk, Younger's office still finds itself in direct conflict with McCone's findings a number of times. The McCone Commission goes after the DA's office, and they're like, you need to do something about the police. The commission charges his office outright of not properly processing police brutality cases related to Watts. Younger slaps back in the press a number of times, reducing the pending brutality cases to more or less cases of discourtesy, bad judgment, or inefficiency. Several months later, in December of 1965, Younger, McCone, and Christopher were all featured speakers at the Southern California Conference on Crime and Delinquency, which had been due to feature then U.S. Attorney General I nearly said New Heidecker for some reason.
Wow.
Leave that in. Had been due to feature then U.S. Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, who had actually been the originator of the Warren Commission, because he was the author of the famous, quote-unquote, "The public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin" memo that originated Younger's friend Earl Warren's commission. Chairman of the event was James Corman, then a House of Representatives member from California, but who would spend his post-congressional career acting as a lobbyist for MCA, headed by the infamous Lew Wasserman, the man who more or less created Ronald Reagan. This is I don't even think this is the first time, but this is not the last time that MCA and Lew Wasserman's name are going to be appearing here. A huge topic at this particular conference on crime and delinquency, aside from Evelle Younger's usual harping on the danger of young people, was the need to quote-unquote revolutionize law enforcement for the coming age. Then California Attorney General Thomas C. Lynch spoke about California police's burgeoning use of computers and data analysis. Specifically cited were the LAPD's collaboration with System Development Corps to form a criminal database, as well as Western Teletype's work with the California Highway Patrol to establish field retrievable license plate databases. And all of this very closely follows in line with the Inherent Vice's ARPANET subplot, I think.
In the aftermath of Watts, Younger would take to the press and the speaking circuit at events like the Conference on Crime and Delinquency to again beat the drum, warning of the dangers of California's youth population, and consistently warning audiences that, while California already had a massive youth population now, it would grow 110% by 1975, and that something had to be done to control an upcoming, quote-unquote, devastating wave of crime waged against American society. Younger's prescience here of the battles his offices were soon to fight against the anti-war movement, black leftists, and the New Left is admittedly startling, and it's very obvious that he and the grander GOP were choosing their next targets.
In January of 1966, Younger moderated a television debate aired on KABC TV, featuring then Attorney General of Alabama Richard Flowers, entitled "The Lawyer and the Unpopular Cause." Flowers had been involved in bitter disputes with legendary racist governor of Alabama George Wallace, and had recently prosecuted the case of the murder of Viola Liuzzo, a white civil rights activist who had been murdered in Alabama by the KKK. It was later revealed in the 1970s that, in classic KKK fashion, at least one of the men who'd killed Liuzzo had been a paid agent of the FBI's COINTELPRO program. Gary Thomas Rowe, the Klan member involved, definitively proven to have been an FBI agent, was later generously put into witness protection by the U.S. government. J. Edgar Hoover, projecting his own life yet again, personally intervened to have stories planted in the press that Liuzzo was a heroin addict who was only involved in the civil rights movement due to her supposed nymphomania.
What piece of fucking shit.
Right.
J. Edgar sucked my fucking dick.
That's one of the best things, not to turn back to James Ellroy, but it's like one of the best things about those Ellroy novels, like the ones that feature J. Edgar Hoover, and many of them do, but like one of the best things that he does is just depict like how nakedly, like, it was, like, a psychosexual thing with him.
Right.
That's always, like, it's, like, the grand thing with Elroy's depiction of J. Edgar Hoover is, like, yeah, I'm collecting all this information, but I'm collecting it to jack off to it.
He's a fucking freak.
Just a genuinely, like, somebody who should have been in, like, a rubber room since he was, like, 17.
Right. He's absolutely depraved monster who's just regarded as this, like, pillar of morality.
Right.
Even to this day. Moving on. As we discussed in the last part of our Evelle Younger series, in January of 1966, Younger was nominated and accepted by LBJ to the rank of Brigadier General in the Air Force Reserve. Younger was a highly active Air Force reservist, even into his years as DA and Attorney General, typically serving his assigned reserve time in Washington, D.C. Ooh-ee-oo.
Ooh-ee-oo.
Younger also maintained a relationship with the Air Force's shadowy Office of Special Investigations, who have been highly implicated in any number of controversies, ranging from drug trafficking to UFOs.
And we talked about it in our reading of Pynchon's A Journey into the Mind of Watts. Younger's office became highly involved in the inquest into Leonard Deadwyler's murder in May of 1966. Deadwyler had been pulled over while driving his pregnant wife to the hospital, whereupon an LAPD officer put his gun to Deadwyler's head and shot him dead behind the wheel of his car. The LAPD claimed that Deadwyler had been drunk and speeding. They claimed that Deadwyler had drunk an amount of alcohol that would have left him incapable of walking, let alone driving, and almost all witnesses to the shooting denied that he'd been going any faster than 40 miles per hour. The LAPD then changed their story to claim that Deadwyler had tried to take off from the officers who'd pulled him over, at which point the officer's gun had gone off when knocked by Deadwyler's car. This was again disproven, as Deadwyler had parked his car closely behind another, leaving him with nowhere to pull. Despite an inquest lasting over 8 days, at the time the longest inquest in LA County history, an almost completely white jury ruled Deadwyler's death an accidental homicide.
Younger's office made continued press releases calling for people to trust the investigation process as the inquest and trial regarding Deadwyler's murder continued. As mentioned in Pynchon's article, many protests erupted in the wake of the Deadwyler murder, though violence never broke out as had happened in Watts a year before. LAPD Chief of Police Whiskey Bill Parker specifically alleged that these protests were the result of communist agitation in Los Angeles and had the California National Guard placed on alert during the Deadwyler inquest. Parker had also set up a liaison between the LAPD, the National Guard, and local Army units, allowing the city government immediate access to federal troops in the event of another uprising. In an odd turn, Deadwyler's family was represented by a young Johnny Cochran, who would go on to become the most famous lawyer in the country 25 years later in 2 more moments of extreme racial tension in Los Angeles: the assault of Rodney King and the murder trial of O.J. Simpson. Cochran went out of his way to compliment Younger in the press, saying, quote, "I thought he made a sincere effort to get all the facts," end quote, which seems plainly evinced in the fact that Younger's office helped 2 LAPD officers get away with blatant murder. Cochran seems to have served as an important factor in terms of helping divert attention in the Deadwyler case away from the city government and LAPD, which is certainly odd given the roles he would later play in LA racial politics.
Younger, with the help of several black players from Doc Sportello's beloved LA Lakers, as well as the UCLA football team, he led a drive called, quote-unquote, Cool Heads for the Long Hot Summer at local majority black and Latino high schools in the aftermath of the Deadwyler murder, attempting to have young people sign petitions saying they would not protest or take part in street actions, which would make them, in Younger's words, quote-unquote, the cool heads. Ugh. Fucking A. This was like my least favorite part of all this research. Although not full-time members of the Coolhead program, Bill Cosby is reported in a number of newspapers to have performed at several of their events, with another one of them being an open recording session for local teenagers by Billy Preston, who would shortly go on to record with the Beatles in their final years and the Rolling Stones at the height of their power. That's Billy Preston on piano and organ on Get Back, if you want to hear it. And I don't need to think too hard about an LAPD connection to somebody working at Apple Records. I really don't have, I don't want to fucking think too hard about that in Charles Manson, because I will start screaming and like climbing walls. Anyway, Younger repeatedly stressed to multiple local papers, quote, "All we ask is that the youth recognize that what happens to them is really their own responsibility," which is just a fucking disgusting fascistic statement to make in the aftermath of the LAPD's wanton murder of an expectant father who had just turned 25. Murdered in front of his own pregnant wife. A number of leaders in Black and Latino civic organizations spoke very harshly against the Coolheads campaign. They called it stereotyping their communities, treating them in an obviously patronizing fashion. Among those who spoke out against the Coolhead drives was Ron Karenga, who is mentioned in Inherent Vice, who would later go on to form the US movement, and who famously spent most of his career being accused of being a stooge for the FBI before serving time in prison for kidnapping and sexually torturing several of his female followers. The US organization is also very important in the Manson lore because their shootout with the Black Panthers supposedly is one of the major contributors to Manson's paranoia regarding the Black Panthers, and all of that was an FBI sting against the Black Panthers.
In early June of 1966, Younger, as well as several other city officials, including LA Sheriff Peter Pitches, received an astronomical pay raise of $625 per month, roughly $6,300 in 2026 money, under the absurd reasoning that, quote, "The United States is now in a state of war in South Vietnam," unquote, a war which was never formally declared. This raised Younger's pay to $35,000 a year in 1966, which is well over $300,000 a year today. All of the LA officials involved also received 10 months of back pay, amounting to roughly $63,000 in 2026 money. This is one of a number of extremely puzzling, highly suspicious financial dealings that Younger would be involved with, culminating in his involvement in the geotech petroleum scandal in the mid-70s that we will deal with soon. It also means that among his many other personal failings, Evelle Younger was literally a war profiteer.
So not long after that, this was from early July of 1966, Younger was back in the papers complaining that the newly decided case of Miranda versus Arizona, which established Miranda right, would quote-unquote open prison doors for convicted criminals, and a lot of his complaints basically amounted to the fact that his officers would now have a much harder time obtaining confessions via entrapment. Let me read to you from the Star Tribune on July 10th of 1966. Younger's statement. "A number of persons have asked recently if our cases will be affected by the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Miranda versus Arizona. The answer is that we are facing some severe problems. The chief of our trials division, J. Miller Levy, believes that where the confession is crucial, we may lose every case now on its way to court. In many instances, it is difficult to predict the effect of Miranda. All we are sure of is that we are up against the most rigid restrictions yet established against the taking of confessions. But what happens will depend often on the judge. It is my feeling that whatever the problems, things will not be so serious that we can't make an adjustment. In many cases, confessions are not crucial, and some defendants will talk freely even though there is no suggestion that they should." Younger, LAPD Chief Parker and LA Sheriff Pitchess would take to the press, typically in the younger allied fascist-owned LA Times, repeating in the coming weeks to bemoan the tide of overturned cases in Los Angeles as the result of the institution of Miranda rights. Just for the record, that's like, the police arrest you if you've ever watched Cops or whatever. You have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, just the general things this is the institution of the police being required to read that. But all of these guys take to the papers to complain about this. Almost all of these were accompanied by way of Younger's connections with Otis Chandler, notable fascist, at the LA Times, by way
I'm
of
sorry, the
massive
fascist LA Times.
They are. Like, if you spent as much time as I did reading these fucking LA newspapers, you'd hate the fucking LA Times too. I'm sorry. Because they would run these massive, sensational fucking headlines about fucking bloodthirsty, convicted, always ethnic. These people are never just white. This is never fucking John Smith that's been set free because of these Miranda rights, or like, it's just a terrible fucking newspaper. They just, especially you go back and read this old stuff, it's like, man, this is the most racist, sensationalistic fucking claptrap it's like Fox News. It's no different than fucking Fox News.
In December of 1966, foreshadowing the coming controversies regarding the PDID surveillance of Mayor Tom Bradley, Younger's DA office, as well as Peter Pitchess's sheriff office, were both hit with accusations that they had been bugging county employees, including their own subordinates. These accusations stemmed from for the time, massive order of 22 miniaturized tape recorders. These were more than likely recently declassified UMY-25 or M75B units, the M75B being a version of the UMY-25 produced for the law enforcement market that had originally been made for the CIA. These units seem to have been about the size of a large smartphone, were voice-actuated, and were easily hidden in a suit pocket, purse, or desk. Given that Peter Pitchess was also a fellow special agent of the FBI, where he'd certainly have learned these tactics as well as Younger, this is more than likely true. Pitchess served much as Younger's equivalent figure within the LA Sheriff's Office. A modernizing ex-FBI man, he helped Eugene Biscaylis with the aforementioned adoption of helicopters by the LAPD and LASO, so that's the Sheriff's Office, as well as introducing computers and teletype links to LASO offices in the late 60s. Pitchess also helped establish the first forerunners to the modern SWAT teams, the quote-unquote Special Enforcement Bureau.
So, in February of 1967, Evelle Younger became involved in a membership drive for the LA branch of the National Urban League, which was a it still is, not was, a black organization primarily concerned with issues of solving black unemployment. They also generally do work to bolster black-owned businesses in general. So you can imagine sort of like, it's a very capitalistic organization. It's a very... They did some good work in the early years of the 20th century regarding black people in the workplace, but by the middle of the century, they were sort of degrading into a lot like what's described in Pynchon's depictions of black employment programs in his article, A Journey into the Minds of Watts, which is to say that this is primarily assimilationist group who were ultimately hostile to really any form of black radicalism. Really, the important thing here is, though, that yet again, we have Evelle Younger, though, right here beside Bill Cosby, who wasn't really famous enough to be the center of this membership drive, but he was successful enough to be mentioned in all of the press related to it. It's worth pointing out here, if you're not fully aware, by 1967, Bill Cosby's Bill Cosby's history of sexual crimes and rapes and date rapes, whatever you want, all of these things that he has done, it's well underway by 1967. And I think that his seeming proximity to the DA of LA County, I think it's really interesting, and it could certainly go a ways in explaining the fact that, even at this point, he was getting away with this and remaining unpunished.
In March of 1967, Younger joined a number of prominent LA citizens in honoring LA Chief of Police Thomas Redden. Among those with Younger that night seems to have been Wesley Grapp. That's another good name.
These crazy-ass names in this episode.
Yeah. Wesley Grapp, who at that time was the head of the FBI's Los Angeles branch. Grapp, so Grapp, who had also been the head of security for the legendary Flying Tiger Airlines, is primarily noteworthy in a Pynchonian context, as he was the primary FBI agent working with University of California Regent Edwin Pauley to facilitate infiltration of and opposition to the student anti-war movement throughout all of the UC campuses. Pauley would shortly be the namesake of LA's Pauley Pavilion, mentioned in Inherent Vice as the setting of Trillium Fortnite and Puck Beaverton's Meet Cute.
And check our Twitter page, because there should be a thread about Edwin Pauley coming up at about the same time that this episode goes up, and there's some more interesting stuff to read there. Our last point for this episode comes a little bit later in March of 1967, when Evelle Younger publishes the 61-page Civil Disturbance Manual for Law Enforcement. And that's compiling everything he's learned through the course of his DA career, with all of these protests and civil rights eruptions, and all of which his own police department have caused. So he writes a manual for the benefit of his brother officers. Fairly soon, he would expand on this even further into an article entitled How to Start a Riot. It's how to start a riot, a member of the DA writing an article called How to Start a Riot. And that gets read into the Senate Congressional Record by Republican Senator George Murphy, who is actually the first motion picture actor to be elected into office in the country. He predates Reagan in that respect. So this is an excellent place to leave off, because for our next episode, we're going to be reading that article, How to Start a Riot, and we're going to be talking a bit about it in the Pynchonian context. We're going to be furthering our examinations of Evelle Younger, and they're going to contain that exact kind of police training technocratic thrust, and we're going to keep looking at his office's meddling with the Black radical movement, the Black population of California in general, until it culminates in this huge explosion that was the SLA and the murder of George Jackson. And so with that, I think we're done.
Yeah, thank you.
And
thank you for listening.
We want to say thank you so much. Thank you so much for waiting as long as it took to get this out. It took a minute, I know, but we want to thank everybody. We want to thank everybody, especially everybody in the Slow Learners Association.
Right, which reminds us, we should plug our shit.
Right, it's time here at the end, to plug our shit. Be sure to follow.
Go to Patreon, search Screaming Reverberations Podcast. You can join for free. Most of our shit's for free. And we have a Twitter page, which is
at Screaming Rev Pod.
Mm-hmm.
At Screaming Rev Pod, which, like I said, we're going to have some really good stuff up there about Edwin Pauley and Gilligan's. We're going to be excavating the Gilligan's Island thing with a thread around the time this episode comes out. So keep an eye on our Twitter page. If you're not on Patreon for some reason, we are on other things, but please go on to Patreon and subscribe. Even if you're not on Patreon, plug your email into there. Give us a subscription, because the numbers look nice and it encourages other people to do it.
Yeah, and we have more. So we are on all of the major platforms like Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podbean. I don't know what
Right.
iHeartRadio. We're on
Are
it.
we?
We're on everything almost except
Are we on YouTube?
Yeah, we are. We're on YouTube.
Like the full episodes
Yeah.
are up on YouTube?
Yeah, but like we have these things called side quests and other mini episodes and like live episodes that we exclusively just post on Patreon for free.
Which admittedly on a number of these things we trim the music out, and if you're not on Patreon, you're not getting the full experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening and like all your likes and reposts.
All the likes, all the reposts, all the everything. And if you're not already subscribe, do the fucking thing.
Yeah.
Maybe at some point we won't have to go through the humiliation of having to say that.
Right. I mean, we should like be more up on, I don't know.
Right.
This stuff, because everyone does it.
Everyone, right. We should record one of these that's really good and like just tack it on at the end of it.
Like and subscribe.
Right.
Follow us for more.
But anyway.
Okay.
We want to thank you so deeply. We love all of you very much.
Not all of you. Some of you are a little. You get some comments are like, but anyway, we still love you.
All right. With that, it's been good.
All right, until next time.
Until next time, which won't be long.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.